All right, welcome back to Bible Time, episode 95. We are in Psalm 27. Go ahead and read through that and pray over it, and we'll get into it together. So if I were to preface this psalm on what it's about, I would define it as a perspective for the day of battle, right? This prayer and this confession of David is this faithful testimony to the Lord, and I think as David is writing this even for himself, he is writing this for the perspective of other kings that would come, that in the day of battle, this is the mindset you need to have. This is the perspective you need to have. Because to be a king in Israel is not to be another king. It's to be the king with a God who is in charge of everything, right? So your concerns aren't like the concerns of the world and these other kings. So let's get into this. We see that we have a Psalm of David, and we've talked about prior that this little phrase in italics that says a psalm really isn't there in the Hebrew. It's kind of to just smooth it over for us, but I don't really think we need it. I think we can understand of David means that it's by David. David's the author, and so this is a king who is writing here. He says that Yahweh is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is my defense of my life. Whom shall I dread? So we have this threefold description of the provision of Yahweh, that he is light, salvation, and defense. Right? So this threefold description with two confessions, whom shall I fear and whom shall I dread? Right? It's almost this obvious question of, if I have the Lord as my light being that he illuminates the things that I might be afraid of. In the day of battle, if the enemy is around you and there's darkness and there's the mystery and the fear of the unknown, he's saying that the Lord illuminates that. And not only does he show me what I don't see, he saves me from it. So what do I need to be afraid of? Whom shall I fear? The Lord is my defense of my life. Whom shall I dread? Right? That the Lord, David believes not only will the Lord ultimately save him, in an eternal sense. He doesn't just believe that God is going to provide for him and deal with his enemies in the end. He does believe, because he's a king, because he's an Israelite, that the Lord will defend him in his life. And even when we read through the book of Kings, we see 1st and 2nd Kings, the amount of kings that God says, not because of your own faithfulness, but because of my servant David, I'm not going to destroy you. And I'm going to keep your line going because I made these promises to David. So David believes that the Lord will defend him in his life. So what does this mean for him? That if the Lord can show you your enemies, save you from your enemies, and then maintain and defend your life from your enemies, this natural question is, whom shall I fear? Whom shall I dread? Right? This word dread being the idea of trembling. Right? Why do I need to tremble if I have the Lord? I don't need to tremble before anyone. I have Yahweh on my side. He says, when evildoers came upon me to devour my flesh, and adversaries and my enemies, they stumbled and fell. Right? This description of their goal is to devour his flesh. Right? They want to destroy his life. They want to kill him. It's like the animals that he has referenced in other Psalms where he's talking about the enemies being lions and bulls and dogs. All right, this is the way he describes his enemies. And in reference for David being a shepherd, this is such a similar idea that the Lord told David that he took him out of the field shepherding sheep to shepherd his people Israel. Right? And just like David needed to defend his sheep from these wild animals, that's the way he describes these adversaries. So he says that when these people came, when the wicked come to fight me, they are the ones who stumbled and fell. Right? They are the ones who stumbled and fell. This idea in Israel that has become so prevalent in the promises made to Abraham, the promises made to David, is that there's going to be a reversal. That if people come to bless you, they will be blessed. But if they come to curse you, they will be the ones who are cursed. So these enemies whose goal is to make David stumble and to make David fall, they're the ones who stumble and fall. Because he has a good God, he has Yahweh on his side. And this is kind of the proof. In verse 3, he says, though a host encamp against me, a host being an army, right? My heart will not fear. Though a war arise against me, in spite of this, I will be confident. Right? So you have this problem here, right? There's a problem that these enemies are around David, this host of these armies. An army encamp against him, he's surrounded. He says that his heart will not fear. Right? So you have a problem and you have faith. And in the next line, though a war arise against me, right? A problem, but even a greater problem. It's not just a battle, it's not just an army, but an actual war. There's another confession of faith that's even greater than the first one, right? It's not just that I won't be afraid, but I'll actually be confident. I have so much confidence in God and what God does and who he is and the promises he's made me that not only do I not need to be afraid, but I can actually be confident, right? And he says, one thing I have asked from the Lord, right? In the provision that the Lord has given me, there's one thing that I do ask, even when there's enemies around me. And I think it's worth pausing and thinking, if I were to guess what David is going to ask for, we've seen David ask for salvation. We've seen David ask for deliverance and for vindication and these enemies, and there's false accusers, and he needs help. In this psalm, when he says, one thing I have asked, we almost expect that would be the same thing. But this is what he says. The one thing that I ask is that I shall seek, right? The one thing I ask and I shall seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. David's desire is to be in the house of the Lord. And the house of the Lord, for David didn't have a temple in his lifetime. He wanted to build the Lord a temple, and the Lord said that he was actually going to build David a house. Right? Yeah, that's where this promise that David's line will go forever and David will have a great name and there will be a descendant to be on David's throne forever. That's where this promise comes from. But David says that he wants to be in the house of the Lord all the days of his life. He wants to be where God is. He wants to behold the beauty of Yahweh and to meditate in his temple. Right? This is what David's perspective is. When there's enemies around him and when there's rumors of war and when people come to kill him, his chief desire is to be with the Lord. Right? And this becomes the solution. This desire to be with the Lord all the days of his life is actually what gives him help from his enemies. Right? Because what does he say in verse 5? He says, in the day of trouble, right? When the day comes that the enemies are here and I need help, he, being God, will conceal me in his tabernacle. Right? Where the ark is, where the presence of God is going to conceal me. In the secret place of his tent, he will hide me. Right? The privilege of being with God is that I don't have to fear these enemies. They won't even find me. God will be on my side. He will lift me up on the rock. On a rock being a steady, a place, a secure place, a safe place against his enemy. And verse 6 says, and now my head will be lifted above my enemies around me. Right? So all of this desire to be with God and all the blessings that come with the presence of God, the whole Bible really being about this idea that we need to be restored because there was a time where we could be with God and now we can't. And every time mankind sees God, they realize that they can't. There's this disparity. We're unclean and we would be destroyed. And that's why Jesus comes to the scene and fixed the problem for us to live the life we couldn't. Right, so this presence of God is the basis for David's confidence. And he says that his head will be lifted above the enemies around him. Right, that even if there's enemies completely surrounding me, I'm actually going to be the one exalted over them. Right, and what does it say? And I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing, yes, I will sing praises to the Lord. So there's enemies around David, and he is giving sacrifices and he is singing. And one thing just to make note of is, these sacrifices with shouts of joy, not all the sacrifices in the Bible even have to do with sin. There's sacrifices just of thanksgiving, right? That the Lord has blessed you in this great way. You just want to make a sacrifice to the Lord to thank him. And so David is just rejoicing, even though he's surrounded by enemies, because he has so much confidence in the fact that if I'm in the presence of God, I'm where I need to be, I'm safe, and I'm secure. Right? This is almost, I think about the joy of singing at camp or something like that, or in the sanctuary, but as though there's enemies completely surrounding us, and it's almost as though that is a non-factor because God's on our side. Right? It doesn't even matter for David. Now this is his request to the Lord. He's saying, hear, O Yahweh, when I cry with my voice, and be gracious to me and answer me. Right? This request of the Lord to just prepare to hear his request. And David knows that he needs the grace from the Lord. And I think what we'll see here even is that even in David's confidence that he is, confessing faith to the Lord, there is this real sense that he also is aware of his sin, his need for grace, and his need for the patience of the Lord. He says he's confessing to the Lord, when you said, seek my face, when God commanded David to seek my face, this is a command in Deuteronomy. What David said, he said, my heart said to you, in response to this, your face, O Lord, do I seek. Right? God, when you gave a command, I follow it. I do what you say. So his request is, do not hide your face from me. I'm trying to seek you. Do not turn your servant away in anger. Your servant, this is a term that we see oftentimes used many, many times in 2 Samuel 7 when David is responding to the Lord for the promises that God has made to him. David refers to himself as your servant, your servant, your servant. And so he's saying, don't turn away in anger. And the question becomes, well, why would God be angry at David? God is not temperamental and random. He doesn't wake up and have a bad day. So the only way that God would possibly be angry at David is if David is actually, has sinned, and this is his repentance. Right? So this request of David for the Lord to be gracious and to hear him, to not turn away, to not be angry, right? This is all a request for the Lord to forgive David and to overlook his sin. He says, you have been my help, right? In the past, he's, in these verses, in verse 9 and these lines right here, he's saying, Lord, do this. And here he's saying, you have done this. You have been my help, right? Again, do not abandon or forsake me. And you have been the God of my salvation. To say that God is the God of my salvation is to say that you're the God who has saved me. And so back and forth, David is making a confession and a request. He is leaning on what is true about God and what God has done and requesting that the Lord do the same. And we see such a stark contrast here in verse 10 where he's saying, for my father and my mother have forsaken me. Right? My father and my mother, that being the most intimate relationship, the most unconditional relationship you're going to have on earth, is the relationship that in the love that your parents have for you. And David is saying that even my parents have forsaken me. Right? And we don't know, this isn't necessarily, we're not sure if this is a historical reference that his parents have actually forsaken him, or if he's using this as an example that, if your most intimate relationship has forsaken you, but the Lord will take me up. Take me up, this phrase having almost the idea of the Lord adopting David, that even if my parents forsake me, right, they have forsaken me. And he's asking the Lord, do not forsake me. And this is his confession that even if my parents forsake me, you will be the one to adopt me. So not only will you not forsake me, you will actually be the one to take me up, to bring me in, to lead me. Right? This is David's confession. Verse 11, teach me your ways, O Lord, and lead me in a level path because of my foes. All right, verse 11 shows a very necessary and important lesson to learn from this, and this is that when God saves you, the necessary and obvious response is obedience. Right? David is saying, Lord, you have saved me and you provide for me, so teach me how to live. Teach me how to obey. Teach me how to live in light of that, and lead me in a level path. Your way being your word, and the way that your word has described life for us. To lead me in a level path, to keep me consistent. Don't let me veer off the path. And why? Because of my foes. Right? What is at stake for David as a king? What's at stake is that for him to sin, for him to fail, is for Israel to bear the responsibility and for them to follow in his footsteps. And there is too much going on. There is too much at stake for David to not understand this. And that's why he's saying that, Lord, save me and teach me how to obey, because there's too much. There's foes. And he says, do not deliver me over to the desires of my enemies. Well, why would God do that? The only reason that God delivers Israel into their enemies is to discipline them. It's a curse that's related to the law. When they fall short, when they fail, their enemies gain control over them. And they have to pay tribute to their enemies. Right? And David is saying, don't let that happen. Teach me how to live so that I can be faithful and I can trust you and I don't lean on myself. And when we go to battle, you're the one who's fighting. So David says that there's enemies, there's too much at stake, there's false witnesses have risen against me. So David acknowledges his own guilt. He knows that the Lord, it would be just to be angry against him, and so he appeals for mercy. But at the same time that David has a level of guilt, there's still false witnesses. Right? They've risen against him, and they're so evil that they're the kind of men who breathe out violence. Right? It is as simple as breathing for them. With every breath, is wickedness, violence, despair. Lord, that's why I need you on my side. That's why I need you to teach me how to live. Right? In the Bible, wisdom is not just being smart and something being better than something else, but wisdom tied to the fear of the Lord, tied to the Word of God, is a moral thing. Right? To be unwise, to be a fool, is to be immoral and to be against the Lord. And so David is saying, I need you to teach me how to live. Right, verse 13, I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Right, David is saying the basis for my confidence and my hope is faith. My faith gives me hope. I would have been despaired if I didn't believe what I believe, if I didn't believe that God will actually provide, not just ultimately, but David knows that the Lord will provide for him in the land of the living, right, in this life, that I would see the goodness of the Lord, that David would look out on a situation and he would see the grace and the mercy and the faithfulness of God. And so this is what he says. This is why I said this is not just David's confession for himself, but on behalf of another king and on behalf of us. Verse 14, he says, wait for the Lord. Wait for the Lord. We've seen this idea of faithfully waiting on the promises of God, not trying to fix our situation and force our will upon our own life, but to wait for the Lord and to trust him. Right? And at the same time that we wait for the Lord, he is commanding, be strong and let your heart take courage. Right? I think of Joshua, be strong and courageous because God is strong. Right? You can have trust in the Lord that if you are doing what God has called you to do, that is a 100% unfailing path. Right? And as Christians, it looks different for us because we don't have these promises that if someone comes and maligns us and says evil things, that the Lord's going to curse them right now. We know that ultimately the prayers of the saints who are martyred are up before the Lord, and the Lord hears those prayers, and he is going to act, and he is going to justify, and he is going to deal with all that evil. But as believers, we know that in this life we might face persecution, and we need to turn the other cheek, and we are not to repay evil for evil. Right? So in our way of being strong and courageous, a lot of times it is just taking persecution and suffering. Right, when Paul was accused of not being apostle because he suffers too much. Right, no one that suffers that much could have God on their side. That's what the accusation against Paul was. And Paul's argument is, no, it's precisely because I suffer, because I follow in the suffering of Christ. When he is exalted, I will be exalted. Because he was raised, I will be raised. So we follow Christ in the way that he lived. So we trust those promises. We wait for the Lord. Even in these times when it's hard, right? When we take communion and we are reminded every Sunday that the Lord may come this month, we need to keep that fresh in our heart and our mind, right? The promise is that the Lord will, not miss a single good thing we do in an act of obedience. It won't be overlooked, right? That's the promises that we have. And so when we think about this psalm and what David is saying, we don't have enemies that are going to surround us necessarily. We don't have this fear that the Lord's not going to be faithful to our promise if we disobey. We are in a better covenant. So we have the faith that when we are obeying, in spite of the fact that it's difficult, the God of the universe will not miss that. Right? That because Jesus has done it, we can say the same prayer, that we can ask the Lord to teach us and to help us, because there's too much at stake. Right? When we think about our own lives, there's too much at stake with Satan trying to, fight the church, and with the world trying to pervert justice. And there's too much going on for us to be, struggling in our own faithfulness like David. Right? We need to be thinking of, hey, our faithfulness doesn't just pertain to my life. It pertains to my faithfulness to the church and the way that I interact with my family and my friends and my ability to share the word. Right? We bring the message of the good news. We need to be ready to do that. And so just thinking through this psalm is this preparing for the day of battle. We do have battle as believers. And to be thinking about that we don't fight flesh and blood, but the spiritual forces of darkness. What does it look like for a Christian to be resting in the promises of God, that we have the hope that we have God with us and we will be with God when we die? That is what should be informing our faith and our trust. And that is what we can take away from Psalm 27.